Have you ever looked at a perfect suburban street? The kind with manicured lawns, gleaming windows, and white picket fences, and wondered what secrets are hidden behind the closed doors? Have you ever felt that the quiet was a little too quiet? The smiles a little too bright? Today's story is about one such secret. A secret buried not in the dark woods or a forgotten alley, but under the very foundation of the American dream. In a place designed for family gatherings and summer laughter. Welcome to Maple Creek, Ohio. A town that prided itself on its simplicity and its strong sense of community. Here, life moved at a gentle pace. Neighbors knew each other by name. Children played in the streets until dusk, and Sunday mornings were for church services followed by potluck lunches. In Maple Creek, appearances were everything. It was a place where success wasn't just measured by your job or your car, but by the perfection of your home, the happiness of your family. It was a currency of unspoken expectations. And no one understood this currency better than the residents of Primrose Lane. Primrose Lane was the heart of Maple Creek's idyllic image. Each house was a postcard of suburban bliss. And at number 12, the Miller house stood as a finest example. Its siding was a crisp, clean white. The flower beds bloomed with perfectly arranged petunias and roses. The lawn was a flawless carpet of green. But recently, a new feature had been added to this picture of perfection. A brand new concrete patio in the backyard. It was stark white, impeccably smooth, and seemed to gleam under the Ohio sun. It was, in a word, flawless, almost too flawless. For the past week, a dark cloud had been hanging over Primrose Lane. Mark Miller, the homeowner at number 12, was missing. He was a good man, a hard-working local contractor, a loving husband to his wife, Eleanor, and a devoted father to their 2 young children. His sudden disappearance was a tear in the town's serene fabric. His truck was gone. His phone went straight to voicemail, and there was no trace of him. The police had been called. Search parties had been organized, and prayers were offered at the local church. The entire town was wrapped in a blanket of concern and quiet dread. And at the center of it all was his wife, Eleanor Miller, known to everyone as Ellie. She was the quintessential suburban mom. Beautiful, energetic, and always involved in the school bake sale or the neighborhood watch. She was the anchor of her family, the creator of the perfect home on Primrose Lane. In the week since Mark had vanished, she had played the role of the distraught wife with convincing grace. She had wept with neighbors, given a tearful statement to the local news, and held her children close, reassuring them that their daddy would be home soon. Our story begins exactly 1 week after Mark Miller was last seen. It was a warm Saturday afternoon. The air on Primrose Lane was thick, not just with summer humidity, but with unspoken questions and worried whispers. And at the Miller house, something strange was happening, something that defied all logic and social convention. The smell of charcoal and grilled hot dogs filled the air. Laughter, faint but distinct, could be heard from the backyard. Ellie Miller was hosting a barbecue. She stood on her new, gleaming white patio, a spatula in one hand and a bright, unwavering smile on her face. She wore a sunny yellow sundress, her blonde hair tied back perfectly. She moved with a practiced grace, weaving between guests, refilling drinks, and making sure everyone had enough potato salad. To an outsider, it was a normal neighborhood gathering, but to everyone there, it was a surreal spectacle. Brenda May, the next-door neighbor, approached Ellie cautiously, her face a mask of concern. "Ellie, honey, are you sure about this? It just seems so soon." Ellie's smile didn't falter. She placed a comforting hand on Brenda's arm. "Brenda, I know how it looks, but I was just sitting in this quiet house, going out of my mind with worry. The kids needed to see something normal. We all did. I need my friends around me right now. It's what Mark would want. He would want us to keep living." The explanation was so reasonable, so strong, that it was almost impossible to argue with. The neighbors nodded, their sympathy overriding their confusion. They looked at this brave woman, holding her family and her community together in the face of tragedy, and they felt a surge of admiration. She was a pillar of strength. Ellie moved back towards the grill, her sunny disposition radiating across the yard. She laughed at a joke from another neighbor, inquired about someone's sick mother, and praised a new haircut. She was a perfect hostess, performing a delicate dance of social niceties on the most public of stages. No one noticed the faint tremor in her hand as she flipped a burger. No one saw the way her eyes would occasionally dart to the smooth, unblemished surface of the patio beneath her feet. a flicker of something unreadable in their depths before the bright smile returned. The patio itself was the talk of the party. It was a professional job. Everyone agreed. Mark must have finished this right before he left, said one man, tapping the concrete with his shoe. Solid work. He always did good work. Ellie overheard him and glided over. Actually, I did it, she said with a small, proud laugh. Mark had been so busy with work. I wanted to surprise him. Finished it up myself last weekend. I had a little help. Of course. She made it sound like a fun DIY project. A wife's loving gift to her hard-working husband. The neighbors were impressed. Ellie Miller, it seemed, could do anything. The children ran across the patio, their sneakers squeaking on the new surface. Adults set their plastic cups and paper plates down on its edges. They gathered in small groups, talking in hushed tones about Mark, about the search, about the strange silence from the police. And all the while, they stood there, eating and drinking and socializing, completely unaware of what lay just a few inches beneath their feet. They were standing on his grave, and they were commending his killer for her strength. Ellie watched them all, a queen surveying her court. Every smile, every word of comfort she offered, was a carefully placed brick in the wall she was building around herself. This party wasn't about normalcy or community. It was a statement. It was an act of audacious defiance. It was a performance designed to prove one thing, that in the perfect world of Ellie Miller, nothing was wrong. Nothing could ever be wrong. Because she wouldn't allow it. As the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the yard, the party began to wind down. Neighbors offered their final words of support, hugging Ellie and telling her to stay strong. She thanked each one of them, her voice filled with a practiced, gentle sorrow. When the last guest had departed, Ellie stood alone on her patio. The smile finally fell from her face, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated exhaustion. She looked down at the concrete, at a small scuff mark left by a chair. Her jaw tightened. She walked back into the house, grabbed a wet cloth and a brush, and returned to the patio. Under the dim glow of the porch light, she knelt down and began to scrub the mark with a feverish intensity, scrubbing away the imperfection, restoring the flawless surface, erasing any evidence that people had been there at all, erasing everything. This is not just a story about a missing man. It is a journey into the dark heart of obsession with perfection, and the terrifying lengths one person will go to preserve that illusion. It is a story that proves that the most monstrous secrets can be hidden in the most ordinary of places. Join us as we begin to chip away at the flawless surface of Ellie Miller's life, and discover the horrifying truth buried just beneath the concrete. The day after the barbecue, a heavy silence returned to Primrose Lane. The smell of charcoal was gone, replaced by the scent of freshly cut grass and the looming sense of dread. For Detective Isabella Rossi, the quiet was deceptive. In her 15 years with the Maple Creek Police Department, she had learned that the loudest crimes often happened in the quietest places. She sat in her unmarked sedan across the street from the Miller house, a file thick with missing person reports resting on the passenger seat. Mark Miller, age 37, husband, father, contractor, vanished a week ago. Rossi was a woman of sharp angles and sharper instincts. She wasn't from Maple Creek. She had transferred from a larger city department years ago, seeking a slower pace. But she never lost the edge that made her a good detective. She saw the world not as it appeared, but as a collection of puzzle pieces. And she knew that some pieces were always deliberately hidden. The report on her lap was frustratingly thin. Mark's truck was a common model, a Ford F-150, with no GPS to track. His cell phone had pinged a tower near a highway interchange 60 miles away, on the night he disappeared. And then it went dead. His bank accounts were untouched. His credit cards were silent. Ellie Miller claimed he had left after an argument about finances, packing a single duffel bag and leaving a short, vague note on the kitchen counter that said, "I need some space. Don't look for me." The note was in Mark's handwriting, but it felt sterile, impersonal. Rossi had seen hundreds of such notes. Sometimes they were real. More often, they were props in a play. And then there was the barbecue. News of the gathering had reached the station that morning, courtesy of an anonymous tip from a concerned neighbor. Rossi had listened to the message twice. A party. A week after a man disappears, his wife throws a party. It wasn't illegal. It wasn't even evidence of a crime. But it was a loud, clanging bell in the quiet halls of Rossi's investigation. It was a piece that didn't fit. She got out of her car and walked up the pristine pathway to the Miller's front door. Before she could ring the bell, the door opened. Ellie stood there, dressed in modest jeans and a simple white t-shirt. She looked tired, her eyes slightly puffy, as if she had been crying all morning. It was a stark contrast to the radiant hostess from the day before. "Detective Rossi," she said, her voice a fragile whisper. "Thank you for coming. Any news?" "Not yet, Mrs. Miller," Rossi replied, her tone gentle but firm. "I was hoping I could ask you a few more questions. May I come in?" Ellie stepped aside, leading Rossi into a house that looked like a magazine spread. Everything was in its place. The pillows on the sofa were perfectly fluffed. The family photos on the mantelpiece were arranged in a symmetrical, loving display. There wasn't a speck of dust or a single object out of place. It was the home of a woman in complete control. They sat at the polished kitchen table. Ellie wrung her hands, a gesture of anxiety that seemed almost perfectly executed. "I'm sorry about yesterday," she began, anticipating Rossi's question. "The barbecue. I know how it must have looked. But I was trying to be strong for the children. They're so confused." "I understand," Rossi said, though she didn't. "Mrs. Miller, I want to go back to the night Mark left. You said you had an argument." Ellie nodded, a tear tracing a path down her cheek. "It was about money. His business, it wasn't doing well. We were in debt. More than I knew. He was so stressed. So ashamed. He said he felt like a failure. We argued, and he just stormed out. He said he couldn't face it anymore." The story was plausible. Financial pressure was a common catalyst for men to simply walk away. But Rossi's gaze drifted past Ellie, through the sliding glass doors, to the new patio. It was a brilliant, almost blinding white in the midday sun. "The new patio," Rossi said, her voice casual. "It looks very well done. Did Mark finish it before he left?" A flicker of something crossed Ellie's face. It was so fast. Rossi almost missed it. A tightening of the jaw. A brief flash of, was it pride? Or was it fear? "No. I did," Ellie said, repeating the story she had told her neighbors. "Mark had bought all the materials weeks ago, but he was too swamped with work. I wanted to do something to cheer him up, to show him that we could still make our home beautiful, even when things were tough. A friend of the family helped me with the heavy lifting." "A friend?" Rossi asked, pulling out her notebook. "What's his name? I'll need to speak with anyone who was here around the time of the disappearance." Ellie hesitated for a fraction of a second. "His name is Ben Carter. But he's a trucker. He's on a long-haul trip to California now. I don't think you'll be able to reach him for a week or two." The answer was too convenient. Another piece that felt designed to stall. Rossi made a note. "You mixed and poured all that concrete yourself, Mrs. Miller. That's hard work." A genuine smile touched Ellie's lips for the first time. It was a smile of pure competence. "My father was a mason," she explained. "He taught me a few things when I was a teenager. The secret is in the mix. You have to get the water-to-cement ratio just right. Too wet, and it's weak. Too dry, and it won't set properly. It has to be perfect." She spoke with the authority of an expert, her hands gesturing as if she were explaining a favorite recipe. It was the most passion Rossi had seen from her since she arrived. The passion wasn't for her missing husband, but for concrete. The interview concluded a few minutes later. Ellie walked Rossi to the door, her demeanor once again that of a fragile, grieving wife. "Please, detective," she pleaded, her eyes welling up again. "Find my husband. Just bring him home." As Rossi walked back to her car, her mind was racing. The perfect house, the perfect story, the perfect wife, and the perfect patio. It was all too much. Perfection was a form of camouflage, and Ellie Miller was hiding something. Rossi didn't know what it was yet, but she had a cold, sinking feeling that the answer wasn't 60 miles away on some forgotten highway. She had a feeling the answer was much, much closer. She started her car, but instead of driving away, she looked back at the house. She pictured Ellie, in her yellow sundress, smiling and serving burgers on that pristine white slab. She imagined the children playing, the neighbors laughing, all of them moving across a surface that had been laid with an expert's touch. The secret, Rossi thought, is in the mix, and Ellie Miller's mix of grief, strength, and calculated perfection was all wrong. It was too wet with lies, and far too dry of genuine emotion. The foundation of her story was beginning to crack. And Rossi knew she just had to find the right place to apply the pressure. The search for Mark Miller was no longer just a missing person case. It had become a search for the truth. And Rossi suspected that truth was buried under a layer of carefully poured lies and freshly set concrete. The investigation into Mark Miller's disappearance crawled into its second week. To the public, it seemed stalled. The police issued another plea for information, circulated Mark's photo again, and conducted fruitless searches along the highway where his phone last pinged. But behind the scenes, Detective Rossi was no longer looking for a man who had walked away. She was looking for a man who had been made to disappear. Her focus had shifted from the vast Ohio landscape to the tidy, quarter-acre lot of 12 Primrose Lane. Rossi started where all good investigations begin, with money. She obtained warrants for the Millers' financial records. And what she found painted a grim picture. Ellie's story about financial stress wasn't just true. It was a dramatic understatement. Mark's contracting business, Miller Built Homes, was a sinking ship. A series of bad bids and a struggling economy had left him with a mountain of debt. Payments to suppliers were months overdue. To major clients were threatening lawsuits. The Millers were on the verge of foreclosure, a fact that had been meticulously hidden from their friends and neighbors. The perfect house on Primrose Lane was a house of cards, ready to collapse. Then Rossi found the centerpiece, the life insurance policy. $1 million. It had been taken out just 3 months prior. Mark was the insured. Eleanor Miller was the sole beneficiary. $1 million payout would not only solve all their financial problems, it would elevate Ellie to a status of tragic, wealthy widowhood, securing her place in Maple Creek society forever. The policy was the motive. Clean and simple. But motive wasn't a body. It wasn't a murder weapon. It was just a theory. To prove it, Rossi needed to break through Ellie's wall of composure. Her next step was to talk to the neighbors again. Not about Ellie's grief, but about the days leading up to Mark's disappearance. She spoke with Brenda May, the woman who lived next door, a curtain-twitching busybody whose nosiness Rossi now found invaluable. They sat in Brenda's floral-patterned living room, which smelled of potpourri and old secrets. Ellie is just a saint, Brenda began, dabbing a tissue at her dry eyes. The way she's holding up. Brenda, I need you to think carefully. Rossi interrupted gently. The days before Mark went missing, did you see or hear anything unusual? Anything at all? Brenda paused, her mind sifting through the neighborhood gossip. Well, she said, leaning forward conspiratorially, there was a cement mixer. It arrived on a flatbed 2 days before Mark left. A big, industrial one. Much bigger than what you'd need for a little patio. Mark must have rented it for a job, I suppose. Did you see Mark using it? Rossi asked. Brenda shook her head. No. That's the funny thing. I never saw Mark near it. But I heard it. I heard it running late at night. The night he disappeared. It must have been after midnight. It woke me up. A horrible grinding sound. I remember thinking it was awfully inconsiderate of Mark to be doing construction work so late. Midnight. According to Ellie, Mark had stormed out of the house around 10 o'clock. If Mark was already gone, who was running the cement mixer at midnight? Rossi's next visit was to the local tool rental shop. The owner, a grizzled man named Sal, remembered the transaction clearly. Yeah, Miller's account rented the big mixer. But it wasn't him who picked it up. It was his wife. Are you sure? Rossi pressed. Positive, Sal said, spitting a wad of chewing tobacco into a nearby can. Never seen a lady handle a rental agreement for heavy machinery before. She knew what she was talking about, though. Asked about the horsepower, the cubic yard capacity. Paid in cash. Said her husband was tied up on a job site and sent her. The lies were piling up. Ellie claimed Mark had bought the materials. Ellie claimed a friend helped her. Ellie claimed she was surprised by the argument that night. But the evidence showed premeditation. She had rented the equipment herself. She had paid in cash. And she had worked in the dead of night. Armed with this new information, Rossi decided it was time for a second, less friendly conversation with Ellie Miller. She found Ellie in her front yard, tending to her roses with a pair of shears, the picture of a grieving widow finding solace in her garden. Mrs. Miller, Rossi said, her voice devoid of the earlier warmth. We need to talk. Ellie looked up, her smile faltering when she saw the detective's hard expression. They went inside, back to the sterile kitchen table. I spoke with Sal at the tool rental shop. Rossi began, watching Ellie's face for a reaction. He said you were the one who rented the cement mixer. You paid in cash. Ellie's composure cracked for the first time. A flicker of panic entered her eyes. She quickly replaced it with indignation. I was helping my husband. He was busy. Is that a crime now? Detective. Helping your husband. And what about the friend you mentioned? Ben Carter. The trucker. Rossi continued. Her voice level. We ran the name. There's no Ben Carter with a commercial driver's license in the state of Ohio. In fact, we can't find any record of his existence at all. You lied to me. Mrs. Miller. Ellie stood up abruptly. Her chair scraping against the hardwood floor. This is harassment. My husband is missing. And you're treating me like a criminal. I want a lawyer. You are not to speak to me again without my lawyer present. The mask had slipped. The fragile, grieving wife was gone. Replaced by a cold, cornered woman. It was a declaration of war. Rossi knew she wouldn't get a confession. Not today. But she had achieved her goal. She had rattled Ellie Miller. She had shown her that her perfect story was falling apart. As Rossi left the house, she felt a grim satisfaction. The legal battle would be uphill. Without a body. She had a collection of suspicious circumstances. But not a murder case. Her superiors were already pressuring her to scale back the investigation. To accept the narrative that Mark Miller was just another man who had run away from his problems. But Rossi couldn't let it go. Her instinct screamed that the answer was right there, at 12 Primrose Lane. She was haunted by the image of Ellie, passionately describing how to mix the perfect concrete. She was haunted by the sound of a cement mixer grinding away in the dead of night. That evening, a new character entered the unfolding drama. A quiet, stooped man in his late 60s pulled up to the Miller house. It was Arthur Vance, Ellie's father. He was a man of few words, his hands gnarled and calloused from a lifetime of working with stone and mortar. He had come to comfort his grieving daughter, to offer the silent, steady support of a father. He found Ellie in the kitchen, furiously scrubbing a countertop that was already spotless. She seemed agitated, her movements jerky and tense. Ellie girl, he said, his voice a low rumble. How are you holding up? I'm fine. Daddy. She snapped, not looking at him. Just fine. The police are useless. Arthur walked through the house and out to the backyard. He stood before the new patio, his expert eye scanning its surface. He ran his hand over the smooth, cool concrete. He noted the clean edges, the consistent finish. It was good work. Professional work. He felt a swell of pride. His daughter had always been a quick learner. He noticed the bags of leftover cement mix stacked neatly by the garage. He picked one up, feeling its weight. He read the label. It was a high-strength, quick-setting mix, an expensive choice for a simple patio. An unusual choice. He walked back inside. That's a fine piece of work out there. Ellie, you remembered everything I taught you. Ellie finally stopped scrubbing and turned to him. Of course I did. Daddy, you always said, the secret is in the mix. It has to be perfect. She smiled at him, but her eyes were cold and distant. And in that moment, a seed of an unthinkable suspicion was planted in Arthur Vance's mind. He looked at his daughter, the little girl he had taught how to lay bricks and mix mortar. And for the first time in his life, he felt a chill of fear. He had taught her how to build, but he never imagined what she might be capable of burying. The days that followed Detective Rossi's confrontation were a quiet war of nerves. Ellie Miller retreated behind a wall of legal counsel. Her lawyer issued a statement decrying the police's insensitive and unfounded focus on a grieving wife. Ellie stopped talking to her neighbors, accepting their casseroles and condolences at the door with a terse, sad smile before quickly retreating inside. The performance was over. Now, she was simply waiting, a spider in the center of her perfect web. But the pressure was taking its toll. Brenda May reported seeing lights on in the Miller house at all hours of the night. Another neighbor mentioned hearing Ellie shouting furiously at someone on the phone. The carefully maintained facade of Primrose Lane was beginning to show deep structural flaws. Ellie, the woman who craved control above all else, was losing it. Detective Rossi, barred from direct contact, turned up the heat indirectly. She re-interviewed every supplier listed in Mark's business records. She spoke to former employees. A consistent theme emerged. Mark was a good man in over his head. But Ellie was the one who managed the books with an iron fist. She was the one who made angry calls about overdue invoices. The one who negotiated contracts with a ferocity that often intimidated clients. She was the ambitious one. The one who couldn't stand the thought of failure. One former foreman told Rossi a particularly chilling story. About a year ago, we were pouring a foundation for a custom home. The client was being difficult, changing his mind, costing us money. Mark was ready to walk away, take the loss, but Mrs. Miller showed up on site. She told Mark, in front of the whole crew, that walking away wasn't an option. She said, "You don't get rid of a problem by walking away from it. You get rid of it by burying it and building over it." We all thought it was a weird thing to say. But that was her. Always about burying the problem. Burying the problem. The phrase echoed in Rossi's mind. It was no longer just a theory. It was a philosophy. Ellie Miller's philosophy. Meanwhile, Arthur Vance was living in a quiet hell inside his daughter's home. He had come to support her, but he found himself watching her, studying her. He was a simple man, a builder who understood foundations, stress points, and breaking loads. He saw his own daughter as a structure under immense, unseen pressure, and he could see the cracks forming. He saw how she obsessively cleaned the house, scrubbing floors that were already clean, dusting furniture that held no dust. He saw how she flinched every time a car slowed down on the street outside. He saw the way she avoided the backyard, never once stepping onto the patio he had initially admired. One evening, he tried to breach her defenses. They were eating dinner in silence when he spoke. "You know, Ellie, that patio, using that quick step mix in this heat, it's tricky. If your water ratio was off by even a little, you'd get hairline cracks when it cures. Could compromise the whole slab in a few years." He was testing her, using the language they had shared since she was a child. Ellie's fork clattered onto her plate. Her head snapped up, her eyes blazing with a cold fire he had never seen before. "The ratio was perfect," she said, her voice low and dangerously steady. "For parts aggregate, to parts sand, 1 part cement. I added just enough water to make it workable. It's not going to crack. It's as solid as a rock. It will last forever." Arthur felt a cold dread wash over him. It was the certainty in her voice, the fanatical precision. It wasn't the pride of a DIY hobbyist. It was the declaration of an architect defending their masterpiece. He had taught her the numbers, the ratios, the science of it, but he had never taught her this cold, hard obsession. The final, damning piece fell into place nights later. Arthur couldn't sleep. He wandered downstairs and found the back door unlocked. He stepped out into the cool night air and walked towards the garage. He wasn't sure what he was looking for. He just felt a compulsion to understand. He found the cement mixer tucked away in the back, covered by a tarp. It looked clean. Too clean. On a hunch, he ran his hand along the inside of the drum. It was mostly smooth, but his callous fingers caught on something lodged in a small crevice near the mixing paddles. He worked it free. It was small and metallic. He brought it out into the moonlight. It was a man's wedding ring. A simple gold band. He knew it instantly. It was the ring he had watched Mark Miller slip onto his daughter's finger on her wedding day. No, that wasn't right. It was Mark's own ring. The one he always wore. The one that was now caked with the faint gray dust of dried cement. Arthur stumbled back, the ring clutched in his fist, his breath coming in ragged gasps. The grinding sound Brenda May had heard at midnight. The oversized mixer. The cash payment. His daughter's obsessive knowledge of the perfect concrete mix. The foreman's words about burying problems. It all slammed into him at once. A physical blow that buckled his knees. He knew. His daughter, his Ellie girl, had not just built a patio. She had built a tomb. She had mixed her husband's body into the very foundation of her perfect home, turning him into an inseparable part of the lie she was so desperate to maintain. He sank to the ground, the cold metal of the ring pressing into his palm. He was a builder. His entire life had been about creating things that were strong, stable, and true. He had built foundations meant to last for generations. And now, he understood that the foundation of his own family was built on a monstrous secret. He had a choice. He could remain silent, protecting his blood, becoming an accomplice to a horror beyond imagination. Or he could do the one thing his entire being screamed against. He could tear it all down. He had to tear down the house of lies his daughter had built, even if it meant burying her in the rubble. His heart was breaking, but his conscience was clear. He knew what he had to do. He had to make a phone call. The next morning, Arthur Vance woke before the sun. Every bone in his body ached with a weariness that had nothing to do with age, and everything to do with the crushing weight of his discovery. The gold wedding band felt like a burning coal in his pocket. He looked at his sleeping daughter as he passed her bedroom door, her face serene in the dim light, and he felt a wave of love and revulsion so profound it almost brought him to his knees. This was his child, the product of his love, and she was a monster. He drove his old pickup truck to a gas station on the edge of town, the kind with a greasy diner and a payphone that hadn't been removed yet. The irony was not lost on him. He was about to use an obsolete piece of technology to unravel a very modern horror. He didn't use his cell phone. He knew Ellie was paranoid, and he couldn't risk her somehow tracing the call back to him. He needed to be a ghost. His hand trembled as he dropped the coins into the slot. The dial tone buzzed in his ear, a sound as alien as his daughter's true nature. He dialed 911. Maple Creek Emergency. ACOM. Female voice answered. Arthur disguised his voice, lowering it to a gravelly, anonymous rasp. I have a tip about the missing man. Mark Miller. Okay, sir. What is the information? He closed his eyes, the words feeling like shards of glass in his throat. Stop looking on the highways. Start looking in his backyard. He paused, taking a ragged breath. Check the new patio. Tell your detectives to check the new concrete patio. Sir, can I get your name? The dispatcher asked. Arthur hung up the phone. The click of the receiver echoed in the silent morning. It was done. He had just condemned his own daughter. He had just chosen justice over blood. He got back in his truck and drove away. Not back to Primrose Lane, but towards the highway, with no destination in mind. He just needed to drive. The call was flagged as a potential crank, but given the high-profile nature of the case, it was passed directly to Detective Rossi's desk. She read the transcript, and a jolt went through her. The patio. It was the one place she kept coming back to. The centerpiece of Ellie's charade. The anonymous tip, combined with her own mounting suspicions, was enough. It was the probable cause she needed. Within 2 hours, Primrose Lane was transformed. The quiet, suburban street was flooded with police cruisers, a forensic van, and a construction truck equipped with a heavy-duty jackhammer. The blue and red lights washed over the perfect houses, painting them in the colors of emergency and scandal. Neighbors poured out of their homes, shielding their eyes, whispering in stunned disbelief. Ellie Miller came to the door, her lawyer on the phone, screaming about warrants and harassment. But this time, her protests were useless. Rossi handed her a signed warrant authorizing the excavation of her property. Ellie's face went pale, her mask of indignation crumbling into raw, primal fear. 2 uniformed officers were instructed to keep her inside the house, to ensure she couldn't interfere. They led her to the living room sofa, where she sat, rigid and silent, forced to listen to the sounds of her perfect world being systematically destroyed. The noise began with a low hum, then escalated into a deafening, percussive roar as the jackhammer bit into the pristine white concrete. Each blow was like a physical assault on Ellie's psyche. It was the sound of her control being shattered, her secret being ripped from its tomb. Chunks of concrete were broken apart and hauled away in wheelbarrows. The work was slow, methodical. Rossi stood at the edge of the scene, her arms crossed, her eyes never leaving the growing hole in the ground. The neighbors watched in morbid fascination. Brenda May clutched her housecoat, her mouth agape. The men who had complimented the patio's construction now stared in horror, realizing the true nature of the foundation they had so admired. After nearly an hour of drilling and digging, one of the forensic technicians suddenly raised a hand. Hold on. I've got something. The jackhammer fell silent. An eerie quiet descended upon the backyard, broken only by the chirping of birds and the distant hum of a lawnmower. Sounds from a normal world that no longer existed on this patch of land. The technicians knelt, swapping their heavy tools for delicate brushes and trowels. They carefully brushed away the dirt and gravel from a specific area. First, a swatch of blue fabric appeared. Then, something pale and unmistakably human. A hand. A collective gasp went through the crowd of onlookers. Rossi felt no triumph, only a deep, cold ache of confirmation. She had been right. Mark Miller had never left. He had simply been moved, repurposed, transformed from a husband and father into the secret ingredient in his own backyard renovation project. While the forensic team continued their grim work, another officer was conducting a final search of the garage and the tool shed. Following Rossi's hunch, tucked away in the back, under a dusty tarp, he found the industrial cement mixer. Following procedure, he began to inspect it. It was, as Arthur had noted, surprisingly clean. But as he ran a gloved hand deep inside the drum, near the central axis, his fingers closed around a small, hard object caught in a weld seam. He pulled it out and held it up to the light. It was a simple gold band. Mark Miller's wedding ring. Inside the house, Ellie heard the change in the noise outside. The violent roar of the jackhammer had been replaced by a tense, focused silence. She knew what that silence meant. It was the silence of discovery. The silence of the end. A young officer came to her side. "Ma'am, Detective Rossi would like to speak with you." Ellie stood up, her movements stiff, robotic. She walked to the back door and looked out at the scene. She saw the hole in her beautiful patio. She saw the blue tarp being laid out beside it. She saw the faces of her neighbors, twisted in shock and disgust. Her entire world, the world she had curated with such obsessive care, was now a crime scene. The lie was exposed. She turned to the officer, and for a moment, a flicker of the old Ellie returned. Not the grieving wife, but the imperious queen of Primrose Lane. "Tell the detective," she said, her voice dripping with a bizarre, misplaced indignation, "that they are ruining my lawn." The interrogation room of the Maple Creek Police Station was a small, windowless box painted a sickly shade of beige. It was a place designed to strip away all comfort and illusion, leaving only the stark, ugly truth. Ellie Miller sat at the metal table, her hands cuffed in front of her. The sunny yellow sundress she wore to the barbecue, and the modest homemaker clothes she wore for the detective were gone, replaced by the standard issue jumpsuit she was given after her arrest. The color drained her, made her anonymous. She was no longer Ellie Miller, the perfect hostess of Primrose Lane. She was just another suspect in a very grim room. Detective Rossi sat opposite her. She placed 2 items on the table between them. The first was a clear evidence bag containing a gold wedding ring, tarnished with a fine gray dust. The second was a single, gruesome photograph of the hand that had been uncovered from the concrete. She didn't say a word. She just let the 2 objects sit there, radiating their silent, irrefutable testimony. Ellie stared at the items, her face a blank mask. The fight had gone out of her. The indignation, the denial, the carefully constructed role she had played, all of it had been pulverized, along with the concrete of her patio. All that was left was a hollow, empty shell. "The game is over, Ellie," Rossi said, her voice quiet but carrying the immense weight of the morning's discovery. "We found him. We found the ring in the mixer you rented. We have witnesses who heard you working late that night. We have your financial records, the insurance policy. We have everything." Ellie remained silent, her gaze fixed on the wedding ring. It was as if she were in a trance, replaying a memory only she could see. Rossi leaned forward slightly. "I just have one question. Ellie, why? Why go to such a horrific length? You could have divorced him. You could have declared bankruptcy. There were 100 other ways out. Why this?" For the first time, Ellie's eyes lifted to meet Rossi's. They were not filled with remorse or fear. They were filled with a chilling, profound frustration, as if she were a master artist whose work had been misunderstood by a world of fools. When she finally spoke, her voice was a monotone, devoid of emotion. "You don't understand," she said. "You don't know what it's like. Help me understand," Rossi prompted gently. "It was all supposed to be perfect," Ellie began, her voice gaining a strange, rhythmic quality, like a recitation. "I had the perfect house, the perfect children. We were the perfect couple. Everyone on Primrose Lane looked up to us. Brenda May wanted my rose bushes. Susan from down the street wanted my recipe for lemon bars. They all wanted what I had, because what I had was perfect." She looked at her cuffed hands. "And he was going to ruin it. Mark. He was weak. The business was failing. And he wanted to give up. He wanted to sell the house. Sell my house. He wanted to move to some small, cheap apartment and start over. He didn't understand that you don't get to start over. You get one life, one chance to build something beautiful. And he was going to take a sledgehammer to mine." The story of the final night poured out of her, not as a confession of guilt, but as a justification of her actions. Mark had come to her that evening, his face etched with defeat. He had laid the foreclosure notices on the kitchen table. He had told her it was over. He said we had to face reality. Ellie sneered, a flicker of the old contempt in her eyes. "My reality was the one I built, not his. I told him there was another way. The insurance policy. It was $1 million. Detective. Enough to fix everything. Enough to keep the dream alive. I told him we could stage a disappearance. He could go away for a while, and I would collect the money, and then he could come back. But he refused. Didn't he? Rossi guessed. Ellie nodded. He called me crazy. He said it was insane. That it was fraud. He said he would rather lose everything than live a lie. He didn't understand. We were already living a lie. The whole town is. I was just better at it than everyone else. He stood up to leave. He said he was going to his parents' house to tell them everything. That he couldn't lie anymore. Her voice dropped to a whisper. I couldn't let him. I couldn't let him tell everyone that we were a failure. That I was a failure. The details of the murder itself were delivered with a chilling detachment. She had hit him from behind with a heavy wrench as he walked towards the door. He had fallen without a sound. It was quick. Efficient. There was no struggle. No messy scene. And then? Rossi asked. Her own voice barely a whisper. And then I did what had to be done. Ellie said. Her tone becoming practical. As if she were describing a difficult, but necessary household chore. I had planned for it. Just in case. A contingency. The mixer was already in the garage. The bags of cement were stacked and ready. I knew Mark was a big man. I couldn't move him easily. So I didn't. I brought the materials to him. The image was monstrous. Ellie Miller. Alone in the dead of night. Turning her pristine backyard into a workshop of horrors. She had wrapped her husband's body in plastic sheeting. She had positioned the mixer as close as she could. She had spent hours, under the pale glow of a single floodlight, methodically and expertly mixing batch after batch of perfect, high-strength concrete. I poured the foundation of the patio first, she explained. Her eyes distant. Then I placed him. And then I poured the rest, layer by layer, making sure there were no air pockets. You have to tamp it down. You see. To make sure it's solid. I worked all night. By the time the sun came up, it was done. It was smooth. It was perfect. The problem was buried, and the foundation of my home was stronger than ever. A profound silence filled the room. Rossi stared at the woman across the table. She had expected tears, a breakdown, a plea for forgiveness. But there was nothing. No remorse. Just the cold, hard logic of a problem solved. Ellie Miller hadn't just killed her husband. She had erased him. She had turned him into an object, an inconvenient variable that needed to be removed from the equation of her perfect life. The final confrontation wasn't a dramatic showdown. It was a quiet, horrifying revelation. The truth had been laid bare, and it was more terrible than Rossi could have imagined. The motive wasn't just $1 million in insurance money. The money was just a tool. The real motive was the preservation of an illusion. Ellie had committed murder not out of passion or greed in the traditional sense, but out of a terrifying, all-consuming obsession with perfection. She had killed her husband to save the life she had built, failing to realize that by burying him, she had entombed herself right along with him. The confession was recorded. The case was closed. But for Isabella Rossi, the image of that perfect, white patio on Primrose Lane would haunt her for the rest of her career, a pristine monument to the darkest depths of the human soul. The immediate aftermath of Ellie Miller's confession was a maelstrom of control chaos. The news broke like a dam, flooding Maple Creek with a torrent of shock and horror that washed away the town's placid facade. 12 Primrose Lane, once a symbol of suburban aspiration, became a grim tourist attraction. News vans lined the street. Their satellite dishes pointed to the sky like metallic vultures. The yellow police tape that cordoned off the property became a stark, brutal frame around a masterpiece of domestic terror. Inside the police station, the wheels of justice turned with grim efficiency. Ellie was formally charged with first-degree murder. Her composure in the interrogation room had evaporated, replaced by a chilling, silent withdrawal. She was no longer the defiant queen or the meticulous planner. She was a void, a human being whose core had been hollowed out, leaving only the brittle shell of her obsession behind. She spoke to no one, not even her lawyer. She just sat in her cell, staring at the concrete walls, perhaps seeing in them a pale imitation of her own handiwork. For Detective Rossi, solving the case brought no sense of victory, only a profound and heavy sadness. She had unmasked a monster, but the monster wore the face of a PTA mom. The evil she had uncovered wasn't a shadowy intruder from a dark alley. It was born and nurtured in a pristine kitchen, amidst the scent of baking bread and fresh-cut flowers. It was a chilling reminder that the most dangerous darkness is a kind that learns to mimic the light. She had the unenviable task of notifying Mark Miller's family, his parents, An elderly couple who still lived in the next town over had been holding onto a desperate sliver of hope that their son had simply run away. Rossi met them at their small, tidy home, as she gently laid out the truth, not the gruesome details, but the final, terrible fact of his death at the hands of his wife. Watched that sliver of hope die in their eyes, replaced by an agony so pure it was almost unbearable to witness. Mark's mother wept silently, while his father just stared at his worn hands, the same hands that had taught his son how to throw a baseball and fix a leaky faucet, now rendered helpless by a grief too large to comprehend. The most heart-wrenching consequence, however, was the fate of the Miller children, a 7-year-old boy and a 5-year-old girl. They were plucked from their perfect home and placed into the care of social services. They were too young to understand the full scope of what had happened. They only knew that one day their father was gone, and the next day their mother was taken away by people in uniforms. They had lost both parents in the span of 2 weeks. Their entire world dismantled by an adult drama they couldn't possibly grasp. Their perfect life on Primrose Lane had been a beautifully constructed lie, and now they were left to navigate the rubble of its collapse. The ripples of the crime spread through the community of Maple Creek, shattering the collective illusion of safety and predictability. The story of the barbecue on the patio became a piece of local folklore overnight, a macabre tale whispered in grocery store aisles and coffee shops. Neighbors who had attended the party were now haunted by the memory. They replayed every smile Ellie had given them, every casual word she had spoken, searching for a hint of the monster beneath. They had laughed and eaten hot dogs just inches above a man's hidden grave, and the guilt of their ignorance was a bitter, nauseating pill to swallow. Brenda May, in particular, was inconsolable. She saw herself not just as a neighbor, but as a friend. She had brought Ellie a casserole the day after Mark was reported missing. She had hugged her at the barbecue and told her to be strong. Now, she felt like a fool, an unwitting accomplice in a horrifying piece of theater. The trust that had once defined their quiet street was gone, replaced by a creeping paranoia. If the perfect Ellie Miller was capable of this, what other secrets were hidden behind the other perfectly painted doors of Primrose Lane? And then there was Arthur Vance. While Maple Creek reeled, he was a ghost. He had driven for hours, the hum of the road a poor substitute for the screaming in his own mind. He ended up in a cheap motel the states away, a place of peeling paint and a lingering smell of stale cigarettes. He sat on the edge of the lumpy bed, the room lit only by the flickering neon sign outside. In his trembling hand, he still held Mark's wedding ring. He had meant to give it to the police, but in his flight, he had forgotten. Now, it felt like his penance, a permanent, cold reminder of the choice he had made. He was a man caught between two impossible truths. He had done the right thing. He had brought a killer to justice and given a good man's family the peace of an answer. But he had also betrayed his own child. He remembered teaching a young Ellie how to hold a hammer, her small hand fitting inside his. He remembered the pride in her eyes when she laid her first perfect brick. He had given her the tools to build, and she had used them to create a tomb. The love he felt for the little girl she once was, and the horror he felt for the woman she had become, were at war within him, and the battle was tearing him apart. He hadn't just lost a daughter to prison. He had lost her long before, to an ambition so dark and twisted he couldn't even comprehend its origins. Back in Maple Creek, Detective Rossi was buried under a mountain of paperwork. The case file for State v. Eleanor Miller was already inches thick. Reports had to be filed, evidence logged, interviews transcribed. But the administrative tasks were a welcome distraction from the psychological weight of the case. Late at night, alone in her office, she would find herself staring at the 2 photos pinned to her corkboard. Ellie's smiling driver's license picture next to an aerial shot of the excavated patio. Light and dark, surface and reality. She thought about the Miller children, now living with an aunt and uncle, their lives forever defined by this tragedy. They would grow up as the children of a murderer, their mother's name synonymous with a local horror story. There was no justice for them, no neat resolution that could mend the chasm that had been ripped through their childhoods. The process of healing, if it could be called that, began with a single, somber step. A week after the discovery, Mark Miller's family began to plan his funeral. It would be a chance for the town to mourn the man they knew, the quiet, hard-working contractor, not the victim in a sensational crime. It was an attempt to reclaim his memory from the shadow of the concrete tomb, where it had been so cruelly desecrated. For a community grappling with a profound sense of betrayal, this small act of remembrance was the first, tentative step out of the darkness. It was a declaration that while a foundation of lies had been shattered, the foundation of their shared humanity, however shaken, would endure. The day of Mark Miller's funeral was overcast and gray, the sky a somber ceiling of steel-colored clouds. It was as if the weather itself was mourning. The small church in the center of Maple Creek was filled to capacity, with people spilling out onto the steps and the lawn. It was a turnout born not just of sympathy, but of a collective need for catharsis. The entire town seemed to be in attendance, seeking to purge the ugliness of the past weeks through shared ritual and grief. Detective Rossi attended, sitting alone in a back pew, a silent observer. It was not standard practice, but she felt a professional and personal need to be there, to see the final chapter of Mark's life written with dignity. She watched his parents, their faces aged by a decade in as many days, accept condolences with a quiet, heartbreaking fortitude. She saw his brother give a eulogy, his voice thick with emotion as he spoke not of his brother's death, but of his life off fishing trips, clumsy high school dances, and the immense pride he took in his children. He was reclaiming Mark Miller from the headlines, giving him back his humanity. Ellie Miller's name was never mentioned. She was a ghost in the room, an unspoken presence whose actions had necessitated this entire somber affair. Her absence was as powerful as any speech. After the service, Rossi saw a familiar figure standing under a large oak tree at the edge of the cemetery, away from the main crowd. It was Arthur Vance. He looked smaller, diminished, the robust frame of a lifelong builder now stooped and frail. He had come back. He had to. Rossi approached him slowly. He didn't seem surprised to see her. He just continued to stare at the casket being lowered into the earth. "I didn't know if you come," Rossi said softly. "He was a good man." Arthur rasped, his voice rough with disuse and sorrow. He didn't deserve this. None of this. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the gold wedding band. He held it out to Rossi. "This belongs with the evidence. I should have given it to you before." Rossi took the ring. "The phone call," she said, not as a question, but as a statement. "It was you, wasn't it?" Arthur Vance finally turned to look at her. His eyes a clear, pale blue, filled with a pain so deep it seemed bottomless. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a confession and a burden shared. In that silent moment, a profound understanding passed between the detective and the father. They were the two people who knew the whole truth, who had seen the full, unvarnished ugliness of the crime, and they were both bound by the weight of it. "You did the right thing, Mr. Vance," Rossi said, the words feeling small and inadequate. A single tear traced a path through the dust on his weathered cheek. "The right thing," he repeated, the words tasting like ash in his mouth. "It feels like the end of the world." He didn't stay. He couldn't. He had paid his respects, fulfilled his duty. He turned and walked back to his old truck, a solitary figure retreating from the wreckage he had been forced to create. The healing process for him would be a long and lonely road. In the weeks that followed, a fragile sense of normalcy began to return to Maple Creek. The news vans left. The police tape came down. The story of Ellie Miller moved from the front page to the back pages, soon to be replaced by other, newer tragedies. The Miller house at 12 Primrose Lane was seized and eventually put up for auction by the bank. For months, it sat empty, a dark monument on an otherwise cheerful street. The lawn grew wild. The once perfect roses wilted on their vines. And in the backyard, a gaping, rectangular hole filled with dirt and weeds was all that remained of the infamous patio. It wasn't ugly. Open wound on the landscape. The town, in its own way, began to heal. The neighbors on Primrose Lane, once isolated by suspicion, started talking again. They organized a neighborhood potluck, a conscious effort to reclaim the sense of community that had been so violated. They spoke of the Millers, but they also spoke of other things: off school starting, of the upcoming football season, of life moving forward. They were stitching the torn fabric of their reality back together, one small, ordinary conversation at a time. For Rossi, the resolution of the case was not the end. It was a beginning. It had changed her. It had stripped away any lingering naivete she had about the world. She now understood that evil wasn't always a chaotic, destructive force. Sometimes, it was meticulous. It was patient. It was creative. It could pour a foundation, smooth the surface, and host a barbecue on top of its crimes. One quiet evening, she drove down Primrose Lane, a detour on her way home. She stopped her car in front of number 12. She looked at the dark windows and the overgrown yard. It was just a house now, A shell of wood and vinyl. The story it held was over. The lie had been excavated. The truth exposed. All that was left was the profound and haunting silence of what comes after. It was the quiet space where victims are mourned, survivors begin to heal, and the living are left to contemplate the fragile boundary between a perfect life and an unforgivable sin. 1 year later, the seasons in Maple Creek had completed their cycle. The brutal heat of summer had given way to the crisp colors of autumn, the deep freeze of winter, and now, the tentative green shoots of a new spring. For most of the town, the horror of the Miller case had receded, becoming a part of local history, a chilling story to be told, but one that no longer occupied the forefront of their daily lives. But for those at the heart of the tragedy, the passage of time had done little to dull the sharp edges of their grief. The house at 12 Primrose Lane was no longer a derelict monument. It had been sold at auction to a young couple from out of state, drawn by the impossibly low price and blissfully unaware of its gruesome history. At least at first, they were builders themselves, a young architect and a landscape designer, who saw only potential in the neglected property. The first thing they did was hire a crew to fill the gaping hole in the backyard. They didn't pour a new patio. Instead, they brought in truckloads of rich, dark topsoil and planted a garden. Where there had once been a cold, hard slab of concrete, there were now raised beds for vegetables and rows of budding perennials. It was a conscious, deliberate act of reclamation, of bringing life back to a place defined by death. Ellie Miller's trial had been swift and decisive. Faced with the overwhelming evidence and her own detailed confession, her lawyer had attempted an insanity defense, arguing that the pressure to maintain a perfect life had caused a psychotic break. The jury didn't buy it. They saw her actions not as madness, but as a chillingly rational, albeit evil, solution to her problems. She was found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, without the possibility of parole. In her final court appearance, she showed no emotion as the verdict was read. Her face was a placid mask, her inner world a fortress no one could penetrate. She had built her perfect world, and now she would live out her days in a small, concrete cell, a final, ironic monument to her chosen building material. Detective Isabella Rossi had received a commendation for her work on the case. It had elevated her career, but it had also left an indelible mark on her soul. She was a more jaded detective now, more suspicious of perfect surfaces. She found herself looking at happy family photos with a cynical eye, wondering what debts and resentments were cropped out of the frame. The case had taught her a fundamental truth, that the pursuit of perfection, when taken to its extreme, becomes a form of pathology. It is an attempt to control the uncontrollable chaos of life, and when that control is threatened, it can curdle into something monstrous. The Miller children were living with Mark's brother and his wife, a few hundred miles away. They had new rooms, a new school, and a new last name. Their new parents were loving and patient, doing their best to build a new life for them on a foundation of honesty and stability. The youngest, the little girl, had few memories of what happened. But the boy, now 8 years old, was old enough to understand. He had nightmares. He asked difficult questions. He was quiet and withdrawn. A little boy grappling with a truth too heavy for his small shoulders. His mother, the woman who had tucked him in at night, had done a terrible, unthinkable thing to his father. His healing would be the work of a lifetime. One sunny spring afternoon, Arthur Vance drove his old pickup truck back to Maple Creek. He hadn't been back since the funeral. He had spent the year drifting, taking small construction jobs in other towns, living in cheap motels, a man in self-imposed exile. He was older now, his face more deeply lined, his shoulders permanently stooped. He didn't go to Primrose Lane. He couldn't. Instead, he drove to the cemetery. It was quiet, the only sound the gentle breeze rustling the leaves of the old oak trees. He found Mark Miller's grave. The headstone was simple and dignified. Mark Miller, beloved husband, father, and son. Arthur stood before the grave for a long time, his hat in his hands. He didn't speak. There were no words left to say. He had made his choice, a choice that had cost him his daughter and his own peace of mind. He had upheld the values he believed in, values of honesty, integrity, and building things that last on a solid foundation. But the cost had been immense. He had learned the hardest lesson of all, that sometimes, doing the right thing means destroying a part of your own world, your own heart. He reached down and pulled a single, stubborn weed that was growing near the base of the stone. It was a small, simple act of maintenance, the work of a builder, tending to a foundation. It was all he had left to offer. As Arthur Vance stood in the quiet cemetery, his moment of solitary grief was interrupted. He heard the soft crunch of footsteps on the gravel path behind him. He turned to see Detective Rossi approaching. She wasn't in uniform. She was dressed in civilian clothes and held a small bouquet of wildflowers. "Mr. Vance," she said, her voice soft. "I had a feeling you might be here today." It was the 1-year anniversary of the discovery, a day of quiet remembrance for them both. Arthur simply nodded, turning his gaze back to the headstone. Rossi stood beside him in a comfortable silence, placing her wildflowers gently at the base of the stone. They were two unlikely companions, bound together by the ugly truth of the case. They had both, in their own ways, been the architects of Ellie's downfall and Mark's justice. "Have you heard from her?" Rossi asked after a long moment. "Her lawyer sends a letter once a month," Arthur said, his voice a low rumble. "She doesn't write them. He just gives an update. Says she's adapting. Whatever that means. She never asked to see me. Never asked about the children." It was this last part that seemed to pain him the most: complete and total detachment from the lives she had so profoundly broken. "And the new family at the house?" he asked, his voice hesitant. "Are they okay?" "They're fine," Rossi assured him. "They know the story. Of course. The whole town does. But they're making it their own place. They planted a garden where it happened. A vegetable garden." A faint, sad smile touched Arthur's lips. "That's good," he murmured. "Things should grow there. Life should grow there." It was a form of absolution, a sign that the ground itself could be redeemed from the horror it had been forced to hold. They stood for a few more minutes, two solitary figures against the backdrop of a peaceful spring day. There was nothing more to say about the past. It had been excavated, examined, and put to rest. "You take care of yourself, Mr. Vance," Rossi said finally, placing a gentle hand on his arm before turning to leave. "You too, Detective," he replied, his eyes still fixed on Mark's name, carved in granite. The story ends not with a dramatic flourish, but with this quiet, contemplative image. Arthur Vance, a man who taught his daughter how to build, now stands guard over the memory of the man she destroyed. It is his final, solemn duty. He is a testament to the fact that foundations are not just made of stone and mortar, but of choices. His choice, born of unbearable pain and unwavering integrity, was the one that ultimately brought the truth to light. The story of Eleanor Miller and the patio on Primrose Lane is now closed, but it leaves us with a chilling and profound question. What is the price of perfection? In a world that constantly pressures us to present a flawless image of our lives, how many of us are hiding cracks beneath the surface? Ellie Miller's story isn't extreme, a monstrous cautionary tale, but it serves as a powerful reminder of the dangers of an obsession with appearances, and the deep rot that can grow from a foundation of lies. So let us look more closely at the world around us, and at ourselves. Let us value honesty over illusion, and strengthen vulnerability over a brittle, perfect facade. Be kinder to your neighbors, and be kinder to yourself. Because sometimes, the most beautiful homes are not the ones that look perfect, but the ones that are strong enough to admit they are broken, and brave enough to rebuild. If this story has touched you, please subscribe to our channel and share your thoughts in the comments below. Join us again as we continue to uncover the hidden stories and the complex truths that lie buried just beneath the surface of our everyday lives.